So lately, I've seen this unnecessary clutching of pearls over China selling 53 or so billion dollars in US Treasury bonds, saying that this is de-dollarization, the US is dying, the US economy is doomed, China is on the rise. Well, it's not. None of that is true whatsoever. So why is China selling these treasury bonds? Is it some nefarious act that they can manipulate the United States? Well, no, really, it's probably because they have a domestic need for it or some other reason. And I'm going to go over these reasons, starting off with that domestic need. Now, selling US treasuries can provide more liquidity that China might need right now to address some of its domestic economic issues, such as funding infrastructure projects or supporting economic growth or stabilizing the financial system during times of economic stress. We saw them selling off bonds to try to support their economy during COVID, for instance. In this case, they will likely use the proceeds from the bond sales to attempt, and I emphasize heavily, attempt to attack their real estate problem. There are enough unsold homes in China to give a house to every single family in both California and New York combined. China's central bank is set to approve what is essentially a $42 billion bailout for state-owned enterprises to buy up some of these homes. The Chinese did this in 2015, and the program was successful back then in stemming a housing crisis. But this time, there are extra variables. Record high youth unemployment means that no amount of loans are going to be attainable by the people that need to be buying these homes. And a declining population of homeowners is creating additional home surpluses. All of the elderly people that purchased homes in the last 30 years are passing away in China, and that's creating a surplus as well. China's home sales fell off a cliff, amounting to around $1.6 trillion last year, which is down 36% from peak sales in 2021. I don't think this bailout is going to have as great an impact as China had hoped, but we'll see. The other reason China might be selling these bonds before maturity is to buy its own currency, especially if the yuan is depreciating too quickly. So earlier this year, it was believed that the Chinese Communist Party executed a purposeful depreciation to make Chinese exports more favorable. This is an attempt to try and get in front of the decoupling or de-risking that China is experiencing from the US and Europe, basically making goods so cheap through subsidies and through yuan depreciation and exchange rates that we would be absolutely stupid not to purchase from China. A big problem China had recently, well, actually over the last decade, is the cost to manufacture goods has gone up, both in obtaining the resources as well as paying the workers, and the logistics has been very cost prohibitive, which has caused countries like the United States to look to South America with much cheaper logistics and labor that is on par with China. So to get ahead of this, the CCP would depreciate the yuan. And when they do this, it means that things on Temu are like $1 when normally they would be like $15. And so when that happens, it causes people to, despite whatever the economic de-risking and decoupling is, they go, that's cheap, I'm going to buy it there. This is actually manipulation. It is technically not allowed, but China does it anyways. China strictly controls the value of the yuan, which is why it is stuck at the number 5 currency in the world, just behind the Canadian dollar. And it is also why it will never, ever overtake the US dollar as the reserve currency. So if the depreciation picks up a bit too quickly or runs a bit too out of control for the CCP, they can sell its bonds and buy back its own currency to generate demand, which slows down this depreciation. Now, depreciation is good for trade, but it also can cause major problems internal to an economy. So that is another reason they potentially could be looking at selling these treasury bonds so it could buy its own currency. Finally, on an extra note, China knows the art of manipulation. China selling bonds makes for good headline fodder. An ignorant headline can make it seem like the US is dying because China sold a small amount of its treasury bonds. Basically, them saying, don't invest or support the US, look at us, they're dying. In reality, this sale is a drop that is part of another drop in an enormous bucket. China could sell literally all of its US treasury bonds, and it would only impact 3.4% of the total US Treasury bond market globally. Why? Well, the US Treasury bond market is $23 trillion with a T. China owns $800 billion of that roughly. And when China sells their bonds, there are plenty of investors, both domestically in the United States and internationally, willing to gobble them up. US Treasuries provide a stable return on investment, and it's not like they disappear if China sells them. Others are willing to take them on the cheap. By selling them, China loses its source of steady income, and if the proceeds from the sales are not reinvested wisely, it could result in lower overall returns on China's investments. And it appears China is not using these sales for its mammoth domestic debt, but instead doubling down and putting a band-aid on its real estate policies that are objectively bad. Meanwhile, US bonds and equities are at record demand levels globally. The Dow just hit 40,000 for the first time ever. So China selling bonds just means another country gains, and it can even be the US that gains. So when I look at China selling these bonds and the doom and gloom on Twitter, which is really just a lot of propaganda, this is another nothing burger.